Welcome back to another Luthier's Tips and Tricks video. Today I'm going to talk about how I cut my fret slots on the table saw. It's an easy way to do it, it's very accurate, and it's quick. First things first, you're going to need a template, and this is what you are going to be duplicating, so you want this to be really accurate. I recommend ordering one that's been CNC routed, so the computer has done everything accurately, so that there's no human error in the equation. So once you have this template made or ordered, then you can use the table saw to basically duplicate the fret slot spacing. So I have my scaling template. This one's 64.5 centimeters, and I've got my fingerboard blank. Now I have already cut this to the taper that I want, and it's thinned down to, this one is thinned down to 7.5 millimeters. It sort of depends how thick you want your fingerboard. But you want the side of the fingerboard that you want slots on facing down. So it's facing down. I put 2 pieces of double-sided tape between the two, and that just holds it really solid. It's not going to move apart as I'm cutting. It's nice and solid, but I can easily take it off once I'm done. Also, when I tape these 2 pieces together, I'm making sure that this fretboard, the finished fretboard, is sticking out just a little bit so that it is against the fence when I'm cutting the slots, not the template, because I want the slots to be cut perpendicular to the center line of the fretboard, not perpendicular to one of the edges of the fretboard. So I am ready to slot this fingerboard. I'm going to go over to the table saw and show you my setup for that. This is my table saw sled. It is perpendicular to the blade, so I have to taper this so that I am cutting perpendicular to the center line of the fretboard, not the edges. So I know my taper, I want it to be 11 millimeters from the nut to the 12th fret. So in that distance, I have actually glued a shim from the nut to the 12th fret. I've glued a 5.5 millimeter shim. So I know that that's exactly the right taper that I want. Now I just have to clamp this in place, and I have to raise it a little bit. And then this little blade actually fits into each fret slot. So the interval between each fret slot is going to remain the same because I am using the template on the top as a guide. Now notice I have the blade offset from the table saw blade. If I was to redo this jig, I would probably put the blade over top of the saw. It's just a little bit easier to know where you're going to be cutting, because right now the nut slot's going to be over from where the template is. But I've written where the nut slot is going to be every time I clamp something to the template. Before I get to the nut slot, I have this area to decide to do some test cuts and decide how deep I'm going to go. I generally like to put fairly deep fret slots because if a guitar ever needs to have the fingerboard planed, then there's a bit more space before the frets bottom out in the fret slots. So I'm going to cut slots about 4.5 millimeters deep, or leaving about 3 millimeters of ebony on the fretboard. There, I'm happy with that depth. Now I can move on to actually cutting the slots. When I'm cutting these slots, notice that this template is not against this fence. That's good because I want the fretboard to be against this fence, not the template. I want because this taper is actually being adjusted for the taper on this fretboard. When I make the cut of each slot, I don't want to back the fence through the blade a second time because that'll actually widen the slot. You can raise the blade for the last cut so that you cut the entire fretboard and off. Depends what the end of your fretboard is. If it's not straight across, then obviously you don't want to do this. So there we go, that's a slotted fretboard. For the nut slot, I only have a fret slot, so if you're doing a 0 fret, that makes sense. I am adding binding to this fretboard, so once I glue the binding on, I'm actually going to raise this blade into this fret slot, raise it, and then just cut it in that spot. So when I'm lining it up for that, I am putting the blade down and basically locking it into where that fret slot is. And then you can actually turn the table saw on while it's just inside the cut a little bit and just raise the blade and finish the cut. And it'll cut it nice and cleanly, cut the binding and everything right where you want the nut to go. Taking the template off of the fretboard, you want to use a sideways motion, not an up and down motion, because this is a little bit weak in all these fret slots. So since there's only 2 pieces of double-sided tape, you can actually sort of flex them apart, stick a palette knife in between, and just work it out toward the outside. And then once one end is loose, you just twist it, and the other end comes loose. If you are not binding your fretboard, then that is all there is to it. If you are binding your fretboard, you want to make sure that you made your fretboard a little bit narrower. At this point, if you decided you wanted to put binding on, you could just plane the edge of the fretboard down until you're to the right width for those additional strips. But it's a little bit easier to do right away, and then you're ready to glue those strips on as soon as you're done cutting all those slots. So that's really all there is to it. It's really a simple process. If you learned anything from this video, please like and subscribe, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.